What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Fireside Giants. I'm your host, Anthony Rivardo. Today, we got an extra special topic discussing how the Giants could potentially find their WR1. We're going to be discussing DeAndre Hopkins and whether or not the New York Giants should consider trading for him this offseason. Now, you all know DeAndre Hopkins. You know what a star he is, or at least what a star he was. One of the best wide receivers in the NFL for years and years. But now, in the twilight of his career, his play is starting to decline. He's dealt with some injuries, some suspension issues. And the Cardinals, blowing things up here, fired their head coach, new general manager. They're looking to move on from DeAndre Hopkins and hopefully offload his contract to a team in need of a wide receiver one like the New York Giants. So we're going to go ahead and discuss whether or not the Giants should make this move. But before we do that, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. And ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. Plenty of excellent New York Giants content coming your way all off season long into the regular season. So without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss DeAndre Hopkins. Now, here's a quote from Albert Breer. He's an NFL insider I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this is about the trade value of DeAndre Hopkins, how much the Cardinals might be looking for or might be able to receive. So, quote, I think it's going to be hard for Cardinals general manager Austin Fort to get great value for Hopkins, maybe even to the point where keeping him is a better idea than dealing him. As it stands right now, if I had to ballpark it, I'd say a day 2 pick would be what Arizona would get in return in a trade. End quote. So, essentially, what Albert Breer is saying there is that the Arizona Cardinals would only be able to get a second or third round pick for DeAndre Hopkins. That is day 2. Anything day 3 is 4th round and onward. Day 1 is, of course, the first round, so a day 2 draft pick would be a second or a third round pick. Now, if you're looking at it from a production standpoint and the talent that you're getting, if you're trading a second or third round pick, especially for a player like DeAndre Hopkins, you are getting an exquisite talent that's definitely exceeding the value of arguably a third round pick. However, the main stipulation here being the contract. Now, DeAndre Hopkins is under contract until 2024. This upcoming 2023 season, he has a cap hit of $22.6 million. In 2024, that cap hit falls down to $11.3 million. However, it's still a lot of money for the Giants to spend up front, considering the fact that they have 2 players in particular that they need to give big extensions to this offseason. Those 2 players being Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. Now, when you look at the New York Giants salary cap space, they do have the 3rd most effective salary cap space entering this offseason at $43 million. But the Giants have some big contracts to hand out, in particular Daniel Jones, who's set to make at least $30 million per season, and of course Saquon Barkley, whose salary could be anywhere from $12 to $16 million per season. So those 2 alone take away pretty much the entirety of the Giants' $43 million in cap space. Now, of course, that's not necessarily true because they can backload the contracts, they can give more money next year and have the cap hit be a little bit lower this year. But when you look at it, the Giants still have other big-time extensions on the horizon. Andrew Thomas, Dexter Lawrence, Xavier McKinney, maybe even Julian Love this offseason. There's a lot of money that needs to go to the Giants' in-house talent. So how would they make room for the talents of an out-of-house talent like DeAndre Hopkins? Well, you've got some players that you can cut. Now, yesterday, Alex and I went over 4 players that the Giants could look into cutting this offseason to free a little bit of cap space here and there. Make sure to go check that video out on the channel. But going a step further, Kenny Golladay is a player who is almost undoubtedly being released this offseason. The Giants save millions of dollars. I think it's around $8 to $12 million, somewhere in that ballpark, by cutting Kenny Golladay. And if they do decide to move on from Leonard Williams, I don't think they will, but if they do decide to move on from Leonard Williams, they could save another few $1 million there. But the real question is cutting those 2 players worth it just to gain a 31-year-old wide receiver in DeAndre Hopkins? Now, Hopkins this season put up 64 receptions for 717 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's a great player still to this day, but another thing to keep in mind is that he's been dealing with some injuries as of late. Now, in 2021, he missed the majority of that season with a torn MCL. He only played in 10 games, caught 42 passes, 572 yards, 8 touchdowns. He was still a great player until he tore his knee. And then he missed the first 6 weeks of the 2022 season on suspension for PEDs. So there's another red flag to add to the mix, the fact that he was just recently suspended. So he had 2 back-to-back seasons where he played in 10 or less games. Now, he was very productive this season in the 9 games that he played. He caught 64 receptions, over 700 yards, and 3 touchdowns. However, it's not the same DeAndre Hopkins that we knew and loved when he was playing for Houston in his first year in Arizona. I mean, in Houston, you're talking about 2017 to 19. He was a first-team All-Pro in all 3 of those seasons. And then in 2020, his first year with the Arizona Cardinals, he was a Pro Bowler who put up 1,407 yards and 6 touchdowns in a season. So DeAndre Hopkins, throughout his career, has been one of the best receivers in the NFL year in and year out. But right now, he's not that anymore. So the question is he still a WR1? Is he still a number 1 receiver for an NFL team? In my opinion, yes, I think that he is. But should he be the number 1 receiver for the New York Giants is the next question. In my opinion, no, he should not be. And some of you might disagree with that because you look at the talents of DeAndre Hopkins and say, wow, this is a really great player. This could mean everything for Daniel Jones, his development, taking that next step. This offense could be electric with DeAndre Hopkins. Sure, it could be. But it also could be completely crippled by the fact that they're paying a 31-year-old wide receiver over $22 million for this upcoming season. So when you look at that, if you look at the player in a box and you take it for face value and say it's DeAndre Hopkins for a 3rd or a 2nd round draft pick, yeah, that sounds like a great deal, but ultimately it's probably a 1-year rental because you're likely cutting him next season anyway because you can't afford to pay him long term. So when you look at what the New York Giants would ultimately do here with DeAndre Hopkins, if they were to play him on his salary of $22 million and then cut him next year, they could do that, but they would still incur a penalty of $11 million in dead cap next season. They would save $14 million, but they would still have to pay a pretty large penalty by cutting DeAndre Hopkins. So realistically, they're going to cut him, but they're going to have a lot of dead cap to pay, and you don't want that dead salary cap space when you're trying to hand out contracts to guys like Andrew Thomas, Dexter Lawrence, and of course Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones. So right now, I think that DeAndre Hopkins makes sense for the Giants in theory, getting a wide receiver 1 for your team. He can go in there, make an instant impact, catch some touchdowns, and give Daniel Jones someone who's reliable, someone that Daniel Jones can rely on to go for over 100 receiving yards game in and game out, right? That's what DeAndre Hopkins provides you. But long term, he doesn't provide you much more than the 2023 season. And what he does do is eats up your salary cap space for the next 2 seasons. I mean, I don't think that the Giants are in a position where they can spend this much money on a wide receiver like DeAndre Hopkins. There are other teams around the NFL that it makes sense for DeAndre Hopkins. I think that when you look at teams who are one piece away, they just need one more receiver, and then that's the piece that gets them into the postseason or past the postseason into the Super Bowl. But that's not what the Giants are, because if you're saying that the Giants are just that one wide receiver away, well, then you're neglecting the fact that they need a new starter at left guard, a new starter at center, and a new starter at right guard. Their entire interior of their offensive line is a mess right now. So the Giants would be better served, in my opinion, trading that pick for a guy like Ayuk, who's long-term a solution because he's only 25 years old, or they would be better served spending their draft capital on the offensive line or on a wide receiver through the draft. And now, we can try and debate whether or not you'd like a rookie receiver versus a veteran in DeAndre Hopkins, but I think that when you look at it financially, trading for DeAndre Hopkins does not make sense for the New York Giants. However, I agree, there is an argument to be made how having this player enter this lineup could mean everything for Daniel Jones. When you look at what happens with Josh Allen when Brian Dable and the Buffalo Bills traded for Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen had that huge step forward and became an MVP level candidate just because he had a WR1. Now, not just because Josh Allen's a great player, but getting that WR1, someone that he can rely on to get open, play in and play out, that did so much for Josh Allen and allowed him to take that next step in his career. I know a lot of Giants fans want to see that happen for Daniel Jones and want to see him get his primary receiving threat so he can take that next step and establish himself as one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Of course, I absolutely agree. But the difference is Stephon Diggs was not a 31-year-old aging veteran receiver in the twilight of his career. DeAndre Hopkins, unfortunately, is a veteran receiver in the twilight of his career. He will likely be out of the league in the next 4 years. I would rather the Giants go ahead and trade for someone younger, like a Brandon Ayuk, and there's other names that are out there, T. Higgins as well, who can be the solution for the next 5 to 10 years rather than the solution for the next 1 to 2 years. So DeAndre Hopkins, me personally, I love the idea of having a WR1 for the New York Giants, but I don't think it can be DeAndre Hopkins because when you look at the salary cap space, you look at his contract, it just doesn't make financial sense for the Giants to go spend their draft capital on an aging 31-year-old wide receiver with a $22 million salary cap hit. Doesn't make sense to me. Now, there's plenty of draft capital for the Giants this season. They're projected to have at least 11 picks because they have 9 right now, and they're supposed to get 2 compensatory picks by projection this offseason. So 11 picks in total, and all you need to do is give up a third-round pick for DeAndre Hopkins. Well, the Giants are likely to have 3 or 4 third-round picks this year. They already have an additional one from the Kadarius Toney trade, so maybe you say you trade that pick for Hopkins, and then essentially you traded Kadarius Toney to get DeAndre Hopkins. That makes sense. However, Kadarius Toney was a second-year player. DeAndre Hopkins is 31 years old and has a $22 million cap hit. It just doesn't make sense financially speaking for the New York Giants, which is very unfortunate. Now, here's an alternative option, right? And I don't know how this would work, but we could spitball it. What if the Giants were to trade for DeAndre Hopkins and immediately go ahead and restructure his contract, give him an extension, bring that cap hit down? Well, then, yeah, that's a possibility, but that's also not something that's guaranteed to happen. If they make this deal, they trade for DeAndre Hopkins, there's no guarantee that they're able to work out the salary cap or work out the contract extension, the restructuring to get his salary cap number down. So I think that this is a move that would be too risky for the Giants because they would be sacrificing too much of their future into a short-term solution at wide receiver, and I would prefer if they just drafted a player at that position or traded for someone a whole lot younger who has a higher ceiling long-term than DeAndre Hopkins. But those are my thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins down below in the comment section. So make sure to comment your thoughts on this WR1 trade scenario down below, and make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this episode, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Again, we have so much New York Giants content coming your way right here on Fireside Giants. Film breakdowns, speculation over trades, all that stuff, breakdowns, everything you want, it's right here on this channel. So make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you do not miss an episode of Fireside Giants. But that pretty much wraps this one up. I'll catch you on the next one. Have a good one, and let's go Giants.